Mile 25.2. The rain had turned the asphalt into a mirror, reflecting the dim streetlights of downtown Portland as Eleanor Price's weathered Nike running shoes splashed through another puddle. Her gray hair, escaping from beneath a soaked baseball cap, clung to her face like silver threads against weathered skin. Every muscle in her 63-year-old body screamed for mercy. But something deeper than pain drove her forward, the memory of Harold's voice echoing in her mind. "Ellie, you've got more fight in you than anyone I know." The sparse crowd of die-hard spectators huddled under umbrellas, their cheers barely audible over the October storm that had turned the Portland Marathon into a test of pure will. Eleanor could see the finish line banner stretched across Salmon Street, its bright colors bleeding in the rain like a watercolor painting left out in the storm. Behind her, the road stretched empty. She was dead last, the final runner in a field of 8,000. But she was still running. 18 months ago, when the doctors told her Harold wouldn't make it through the winter, she'd never imagined she'd be here. When her daughter Sarah called her too old for this nonsense, and her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, shook her head, saying, "Women our age should know better," Eleanor had almost believed them. But as thunder rolled across the Willamette River and lightning illuminated the finish line ahead, she knew this moment would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone who thought dreams came with expiration dates. Hello my friends, before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Multnomah Village had always been the kind of Portland neighborhood where everyone knew each other's business, where morning coffee at the corner cafe came with a side of gossip and genuine concern. Eleanor Price had called this tree-lined pocket of Southwest Portland home for 37 years, raising 2 kids and working double shifts at OHSU Hospital while Harold built his plumbing business from their garage. The modest craftsman house on 35th Avenue had watched Sarah and Michael grow up, graduate, and move away to Seattle and Denver respectively, leaving Eleanor and Harold to enjoy their golden years together. "Eleanor, you've been sitting in that chair for 3 weeks straight," Harold had said last March, his voice already weakened by the cancer that was stealing him away piece by piece. They were on the front porch, watching the cherry blossoms bloom across the street, when he pointed to a jogger passing by. "Remember when we used to walk to the farmer's market every Saturday? You'd race me to the vegetable stand and always win." Eleanor had laughed. But it was the hollow laugh of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to move with purpose. The day after Harold's funeral, Eleanor found herself standing in their bedroom, staring at the closet full of scrubs she'd never wear again. After 35 years of nursing, the retirement party had been nice, the gold watch was pretty, but now, what? Sarah called twice a day from Seattle, her voice tight with worry. "Mom, you need to get out of the house. Join a book club, take up gardening, anything." But Eleanor wasn't ready for book clubs or beginners pottery classes at the community center. It was Mrs. Chen from next door who planted the seed, though she probably didn't mean to. "Eleanor, dear, I saw you walking to the mailbox yesterday. You're moving like an old woman," she'd said while watering her prized roses. "My daughter, in Eugene, she's 55 and just ran her first 10K. Says it keeps her young." Eleanor had smiled politely, but something about the word young stuck in her mind like a splinter. The Multnomah Athletic Club had been Harold's idea years ago, back when they thought they'd have decades to get in shape together. Now Eleanor stood in the parking lot, clutching her old gym bag and feeling like an imposter. Inside, 20-somethings in matching workout gear moved with the confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to be there. "Can I help you?" asked the impossibly young trainer at the front desk, his smile professionally patient but his eyes already dismissing her as someone's lost grandmother. "I want to learn to run," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. The trainer, his name tag, read Kyle, looked her up and down like she'd just asked to learn trapeze. "Ma'am, we have some great senior fitness programs. Water aerobics on Tuesdays, chair yoga on Thursdays, ... But Eleanor was already shaking her head, remembering Harold's words about having more fight in her than anyone knew. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and Harold's old laptop, Googling how to start running at 60. The internet was full of success stories, but also warnings about joint damage, heart attacks, and the importance of knowing your limits. She closed the laptop and looked at the framed photo on the mantel. Harold in his army uniform, young and strong and ready to take on the world. "What do you think, honey?" she whispered to the empty room. "Too old, or just getting started?" The Couch to 5000 app made it sound so simple. Walk for 90 seconds, jog for 60, repeat 8 times. Eleanor had downloaded it onto her phone with the same determination she'd once used to master new medical procedures at the hospital. But standing in Laurelhurst Park at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by serious runners in technical gear, she felt like she was about to perform surgery with a butter knife. "You can do this, Ellie," she whispered to herself, using Harold's pet name for courage. The first 90 seconds of walking felt normal, comfortable even. Then came the jog. 30 seconds in, her chest was burning, her legs felt like lead, and a young woman in neon pink zoomed past her like she was standing still. Eleanor stopped, bent over, gasping for air, and fighting the urge to go home and pretend this had never happened. That's when she met Frank. Frank Kowalski was 72 years old, a retired steelworker from the old Zidal shipyard, and he was lapping the park track with the steady rhythm of someone who'd been running since before Eleanor had started nursing school. "First day?" he asked, jogging in place beside her while she caught her breath. His Polish accent was still thick after 50 years in Portland, and his smile was kind but knowing. "Probably last day too," Eleanor panted, embarrassed by her red face and heaving chest. But Frank just chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "I started running when I was 68, after my Margaret passed. Doctor said I'd have a heart attack. Been for years now, and I feel better than I did at 50. The trick is not to race anyone but yesterday's version of yourself." Frank became her unofficial coach, meeting her at the park 3 mornings a week. He taught her about proper breathing, about the difference between good pain and bad pain, about how running wasn't about speed but about showing up. In the old country, my grandmother used to say, "Ko si you nie zabigs. Tu si you zumochni, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." But she also said, "Kato wolno, jedzi, daliko zidzi, who goes slowly, goes far." The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. After 6 weeks, Eleanor could jog for 5 minutes without stopping. After 3 months, she completed her first 5K race, the Shamrock Run downtown, surrounded by 25,000 other runners. She finished in 37 minutes, dead last in her age group, but she finished. The medal felt heavier than her nursing pin, more meaningful than any recognition she'd ever received, Sarah called that night, her voice tight with worry that had become her default tone since Harold's death. "Mum, running is fine for staying healthy, but don't you think you're taking this a little too far? I mean, you're 63, not 23. What if you get hurt? What if you have a heart attack?" Eleanor had tried to explain the feeling of accomplishment, the sense of purpose she'd found on the roads of Portland. But Sarah's concern felt more like doubt. It was Frank who first mentioned the marathon. They were cooling down after a particularly good 10-mile run along the Springwater corridor when he said, "You know, Ellie, the Portland Marathon is in October. You've got the base fitness now. It's just a matter of building the distance." Eleanor laughed, thinking he was joking, but Frank's expression was serious. "I ran it last year, finished in 5:47. Not fast, but I finished. You could do it too, if you wanted to." That night, Eleanor sat on her front porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky over the West Hills. The Portland Marathon, 26.2 miles through the city she'd called home for nearly 4 decades. The registration fee was $150, money she could afford but had never spent on something just for herself. She thought about Harold, about the dreams they'd shared and the ones they'd never had time to pursue. "What do you think, honey?" she asked the empty chair beside her. "Ready for one more adventure?" The training plan Frank had written for her looked like a medical chart, detailed, scientific, and completely overwhelming. 4 runs per week, gradually building from 30 miles to 50 miles per week, with one long run each Saturday that would eventually reach 20 miles. Eleanor taped it to her refrigerator next to Harold's old fishing licenses and tried not to think about how impossible it all seemed. The first reality check came at mile 8 of her second long run. Eleanor had been feeling strong, confident even, jogging along the East Bank Esplanade, with the morning sun sparkling on the Willamette River. Then her right knee began to ache, not the good ache of working muscles, but the sharp, stabbing pain of something wrong. She limped home, iced the knee, and spent the rest of the day wondering if Sarah had been right about this whole crazy idea Dr. Patricia Reeves had been Eleanor's physician for 15 years, and she didn't hide her concern when Eleanor explained her marathon plans during a routine checkup. "Eleanor, I admire your dedication, but marathon training puts enormous stress on the body. At your age, with your history of high blood pressure and that knee injury from nursing school, I have to advise caution." She ordered blood work, an EKG, and a referral to a sports medicine specialist who looked at Eleanor like she'd lost her mind. The worst part wasn't the physical challenges, it was the reactions from people she'd known for decades. At the grocery store, her former colleague, Janet Morrison, shook her head sympathetically. "Eleanor, honey, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. Running a marathon at your age, that's not normal, that's not healthy." At the bank teller, asked if she was raising money for charity. Unable to conceive that a 63-year-old woman might run 26.2 miles for her own reasons. The hardest conversation came with her children. Sarah drove down from Seattle on a Saturday morning, ostensibly to help with yard work, but really to stage an intervention. "Mom, we're worried about you. This obsession with running, it's not healthy. You're trying to prove something to someone who's not here anymore." Michael joined the conversation by video call from Denver, his voice gentle but firm. "Dad wouldn't want you to hurt yourself, Mum. He'd want you to be safe, to enjoy your retirement." Eleanor tried to explain that she wasn't trying to prove anything to Harold, she was trying to prove something to herself. But sitting in her living room, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a life well lived, she wondered if they were right. The marathon medal from last year's race sat on Harold's old desk, belonging to a stranger who'd accomplished something Eleanor couldn't even imagine. That the breaking point came during a 16-mile training run in August. Eleanor had been running for 3 hours, her legs felt like concrete, and she was still 4 miles from home. The temperature had hit 95 degrees, unusual for Portland, and she'd run out of water an hour ago. She sat down on a bus stop bench, dizzy and nauseated, and called Sarah to come pick her up. "Mum, this is insane," Sarah said, as Eleanor climbed into the air-conditioned car. "Promise me you'll stop this before you seriously hurt yourself." That night, Eleanor sat in Harold's old recliner, ice packs on both knees, and stared at the marathon training plan on the refrigerator. She'd completed exactly half the training schedule, and her body felt like it was falling apart. Her children thought she was crazy, her doctor thought she was reckless, and her neighbors thought she was having some kind of age-related breakdown. Maybe they were all right. But as she sat there in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by photos of Harold and memories of a life that had been good but was now over, Eleanor realized something important. For the first time since the funeral, she wasn't just existing, she was living. The pain in her knees was real, but so was the strength she'd discovered in her legs. The doubt in other people's voices was real, but so was the pride she'd felt crossing the finish line of her first 5K. "I'm not ready to be done yet," she whispered to Harold's photo. "I'm not ready to just fade away." The revelation came at mile 18 of Eleanor's final long training run, 3 weeks before the marathon. She'd been running for nearly 4 hours, her body pushed beyond anything she'd thought possible. When she found herself on the Springwater Corridor Trail she'd discovered months ago. The September morning was crisp and clear, Mount Hood visible in the distance, and for the first time in her training, Eleanor felt like she was floating rather than struggling. That's when she saw them, a group of women, her age, maybe older, stretching after what looked like a serious workout. They wore matching t-shirts that read Portland Senior Striders, and moved with the confidence of people who'd earned their place on the road. "Excuse me," Eleanor called out, still breathing hard from her run. "Are you all marathon runners?" The woman who appeared to be their leader, a silver-haired dynamo named Dorothy Chen, Mrs. Chun's sister-in-law, it turned out, smiled widely. "Honey, between the 6 of us, we've completed 43 marathons. Started when we were all in our 50s and 60s, welcome to the club." Dorothy's story was a revelation that shifted everything Eleanor thought she knew about aging and possibility. "I ran my first marathon at 58, after my divorce. Thought my life was over, that I was too old to start anything new. 15 years later, I've run Boston 3 times and qualified for the Senior Olympics. Age is just a number, Eleanor. What matters is what you do with the time you have left." The group adopted Eleanor immediately, sharing decades of hard-won wisdom about training, nutrition, and the mental game of long-distance running. They taught her about fuel belts and blister prevention, about the importance of negative splits and the danger of going out too fast. But more importantly, they taught her that she wasn't crazy, wasn't having a breakdown, wasn't trying to recapture her youth. She was simply becoming the person she'd always had the potential to be. Frank had been right about one thing: the marathon wasn't about racing other people. But Eleanor was beginning to understand it wasn't even about racing yesterday's version of herself. It was about proving that dreams don't have expiration dates, that courage can bloom at any age, and that the finish line is just the beginning of a new story. The Portland Senior Striders became Eleanor's training partners for the final weeks of preparation. They met every Tuesday for tempo runs, every Thursday for hill repeats, and every Saturday for their long runs. Eleanor's pace improved dramatically, not because she was running faster, but because she was running smarter. She learned to fuel properly, to hydrate consistently, and to listen to her body's signals without panicking at every minor ache. The most important lesson came from Agnes, a 71-year-old retired teacher who'd completed the Boston Marathon 6 times. "Eleanor dear, the marathon will break you down completely around mile 20. Your legs will scream. Your mind will tell you to quit, and you'll question every decision that brought you to that point. But if you can push through that wall, if you can find something deeper than muscle and bone to carry you forward, you'll discover a strength you never knew you had." 2 weeks before the marathon, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Sarah arrived without calling first, her face tight with the expression Eleanor had come to recognize as her daughter's version of concern. "Mum, I've been thinking about what you said, about needing to prove something to yourself. I still think this is dangerous, but I've been talking to my therapist, and she said something that made me realize I might be wrong." Sarah sat down heavily on the couch where she'd spent countless hours as a child, her voice softer than it had been in months. "She said that maybe I'm not worried about you getting hurt physically. Maybe I'm worried about you changing, about becoming someone I don't recognize. Dad's gone, and if you become this new person, this runner, then I lose both of you." Eleanor felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized how much her transformation had frightened her daughter. "Sarah, honey, I'm not becoming someone new. I'm becoming who I always was, underneath all the roles I played: wife, mother, nurse. Those were beautiful parts of my life, but they're not the whole story." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand, feeling the calluses from her new life as a runner. "Your father didn't fall in love with a marathon runner, but he fell in love with someone who had the courage to try new things. I'm still that person, just with better cardiovascular fitness." That night, Eleanor stood in her bedroom, looking at the marathon bib number that had arrived in the mail, #8847, in a field of 8,000 runners. She pinned it to the running shirt she'd bought specially for race day, a bright blue technical fabric that wickered moisture and made her feel like a real athlete. Tomorrow was the marathon, and for the first time since she'd registered, Eleanor wasn't afraid. She was ready. October 15th dawned grey and drizzly. Typical Portland weather that would have sent Eleanor scurrying for an umbrella 6 months ago. Now, Standing in the pre-dawn darkness of the start corrals downtown, she felt the light rain on her face like a blessing. The Portland Marathon began at 7 a.m. sharp, and Eleanor had positioned herself in the very back of the pack, surrounded by other first-timers and casual runners, who were more interested in finishing than competing. The energy at the starting line was electric despite the weather. 8,000 runners filled the streets of downtown Portland, their colorful rain gear and determined faces, creating a river of humanity that stretched from the Willamette River to the park blocks. Eleanor had never been part of something so massive, so collectively hopeful. When the starting gun fired, it took her nearly 8 minutes to cross the timing mats. But she was officially running the Portland Marathon. The first half of the race unfolded like a guided tour of Eleanor's adopted city. Mile 3 took her through the Pearl District, where she'd brought Harold for anniversary dinners at fancy restaurants they couldn't quite afford. Mile 7 wound through Forest Park, where she'd hiked with the kids when they were young. Mile 10 crossed the St. John's Bridge, its Gothic towers disappearing into the low-hanging clouds like something from a fairy tale. Eleanor had trained for this moment, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer joy of running through streets lined with spectators. Strangers held signs reading, "You're awesome, pain is temporary, pride is forever." Children held out their hands for high fives, and volunteers staffed aid stations with the enthusiasm of people who genuinely wanted to help. At mile 13, the half-marathon split, Eleanor checked her watch 2:45, exactly on pace for her goal of finishing in under 6 hours. The wheels began to come off around mile 18. Just as Agnes had predicted, Eleanor's legs, which had felt strong and smooth for the first 3 hours, suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Every step became a conscious decision. Every mile a negotiation between her body's demands to stop and her mind's insistence to continue. The rain, which had been a gentle companion for most of the race, intensified into a proper Pacific Northwest downpour. Mile 20 brought the wall that every marathon runner fears, the moment when glycogen stores are depleted and the body begins to cannibalize itself for fuel. Eleanor's pace slowed from a steady 12-minute mile to a painful 15-minute shuffle. Other runners began to pass her, their faces showing the same struggle but their legs still carrying them forward. For the first time since the starting line, Eleanor wondered if she would actually finish. The lowest point came at mile 22, when Eleanor found herself completely alone on the course. The faster runners were already finished, the slower ones were still behind her, and she was caught in a no-man's land of exhaustion and doubt. The rain had driven most of the spectators away, and the only sounds were her labored breathing and the splash of her shoes on the wet pavement. This was the moment Agnes had warned her about, the moment when the marathon strips away everything except your core reason for being there. Eleanor stopped running and stood in the rain, her hands on her knees, trying to remember why she'd thought this was a good idea. Her legs were screaming, her lungs were burning, and she was still 4.2 miles from the finish line. She could call Sarah, admit defeat, and go home to a warm bath and the comfortable certainty that everyone had been right about her being too old for this nonsense. But then she heard Harold's voice, as clear as if he was standing beside her on the empty street. "Ellie, you've got more fight in you than anyone I know." And suddenly, Eleanor understood what she'd been training for all these months. Not to prove she could run 26.2 miles, but to prove she could face the hardest moments of her life and keep moving forward. The marathon was just a metaphor for everything she'd already survived: Harold's illness, his death, the loneliness of starting over at 6:3. Eleanor started running again, her stride still painful, but her purpose crystal clear. Mile 23 took her through the industrial district, where Harold had once worked on a construction project. Mile 24 brought her back toward downtown, where she could see the tall buildings that had anchored her life for decades. Mile 25 was pure willpower, one step at a time, fueled by the knowledge that she was about to accomplish something that had seemed impossible just hours ago. The finish line appeared through the rain like a mirage. The bright banner stretched across Salmon Street, exactly where she'd dreamed it would be. Eleanor could hear the announcer's voice booming over the PA system. And here comes Eleanor Price, 63 years old, from Portland, Oregon, finishing her first marathon. The small crowd that had braved the storm erupted in cheers. Strangers who had never met her but understood the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. Eleanor crossed the finish line in 5 hours and 53 minutes, 7th from last in a field of 8,000 runners. She had never won anything so completely in her life. The medal was heavier than Eleanor had expected. Not just the physical weight of the medal, but the emotional weight of everything it represented. As she stood in the finishers area, wrapped in a space blanket and shivering from the rain, she was surrounded by strangers who felt like family. Other runners congratulated her, volunteers offered warm soup and blankets, and photographers captured the moment when a 63-year-old woman proved that dreams don't have expiration dates. Sarah was waiting at the finish line, her face streaked with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. "Mom, I am so proud of you," she said, wrapping Eleanor in a hug that felt like forgiveness and understanding all at once. "I was wrong to doubt you. Dad would be so proud too." Behind her stood Frank, Dorothy, Agnes, and the rest of the Portland senior striders, their faces beaming with the joy of watching someone discover their own strength. The story of Eleanor Price's marathon spread through Multnomah Village like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a feature article about the 63-year-old widow who had taken up running after her husband's death and completed her first marathon in under 6 hours. The article sparked dozens of letters from readers, women in their 50s and 60s who had been inspired to dust off their running shoes, men who had rediscovered their love of cycling, and families who had been reminded that age is just a number. Eleanor kept running after the marathon, not because she needed to prove anything else, but because she had discovered a part of herself she'd never known existed. She joined the Portland Senior Striders officially, became a mentor to other women starting their running journey later in life, and completed 3 more marathons before her 67th birthday. Each race was different, but each one reinforced the lessons she'd learned on that rainy October morning, that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing it anyway. The house on 35th Avenue still held all the memories of Eleanor's life with Harold. But now, it also held evidence of her life after Harold. Marathon medals hung next to their wedding photos, running shoes sat by the door next to the hiking boots they'd once worn together, and the refrigerator was covered with race bibs and training schedules instead of just grandchildren's artwork. 5 years after that first marathon, Eleanor would often find herself at Laurelhurst Park, watching new runners struggle through their first tentative steps. She'd think about Harold, about the life they'd built together, and about the life she'd discovered on her own. The marathon had taught her that endings can be beginnings, that loss can lead to discovery, and that it's never too late to surprise yourself. "What do you think, honey?" she'd whisper to the morning air, lacing up her running shoes for another day on the roads of Portland, ready for one more mile. And then Eleanor Price, who had once been told she was too old for marathons, would head out into the world to prove that the finish line is just the beginning of a new story.